Chapter 53. Yamamoto stood in the door of his office as the police guard marched towards Akira. Sweat pricked his brow. After all these years of being almost straight, he had police in his office. Something terrible was happening. Jim looked up from his screen. There was no reason to get excited, he thought. The policemen were extremely respectful. One handed the professor a package with military precision and bowed low. They saluted and marched out. "What was that about?" he asked. "My carte blanche." "Maybe you could get the government to pay Yamamoto-san his $100 million instead," said Jim. "This is getting boring." He grinned at the professor. "Only joking." "How is it?" $2 million, Jim waved his palm back and forth. Ish. Yamamoto was on the phone, jabbering away. He hung up. "Now I'm in trouble. That was my wife. The trading company has been on to her. They want to know if she's okay. She wants to know what I'm doing." He was sweating heavily. "I told her not to worry. She will be hard on me." "Do we have any news from your sources?" asked Akira. "No," said Yamamoto, "but I fear when we do, it will not be good." "What do you mean?" said Akira. "Let us wait till there is news. I do not want to invent ghosts." "Damn," said Jim. "This thing won't let me put on more than $50 million in a trade. Never mind. I can batter the Swissy as well. That looks choice." "What's wrong?" Yamamoto hadn't understood what he'd said. "Nothing," said Akira. "Just a little local difficulty." Kim watched the cage through the closed-circuit TV. The gorilla was grooming the woman's hair through the bars. Kim was biting his lip, chewing on it almost hard enough to break the skin. A thought sent a shiver through him. He took a pistol from his bottom drawer and went towards the lift that rose straight up to the zoo. The animals quietened. Jane heard footsteps on the tiles. "You," a voice said. "Me? Who are you?" "Who are you?" she replied, getting up. The gorilla pushed its arm through the barrier to try to hold her, but she was out of reach. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a pistol. It was a dart gun. He aimed it at Jane, but he was not taking a proper bead. She cocked her head at him. "You should let me go." He lowered the pistol, walked over to the gorilla cage, aimed, and then fired. The gorilla grunted, jumped up, and ran at him, grabbing the bars. It screamed, then fell silent, staggering back, dazed. It sat down, head tilted forwards, breathed heavily for a time, then rolled onto its side. Jane saw the man run his wrist across the door and heard a clunk. The cage door opened. He knelt down by the gorilla and began to stroke it gently. He was looking at Jane and starting to strip off. "You're kidding me," thought Jane, looking away in disgust. She sat on the tiled ledge and gazed out of the window at Tokyo. She considered how surgeons violated a patient's body with their scalpels when they worked feverishly to save a life. The patient would awake from the ordeal none the wiser as to the awful details. The anesthetic would leave their mind unsullied. She wasn't worried for herself, but for the ape. Then she thought about him opening the door with his wrist. Was there a tag in his watch, or a simple band on his arm? Maybe he had an implant, a small RFID under the skin. She would continue to sharpen the plate, and if she could get hold of his hand, she would slice it off and open the cage. She wondered what Jim was doing. Had he called the cavalry? Would they come? Would he come for her? She didn't think so. She was probably alone. That was nothing new. Things were going to get even uglier. The nose of the Antonov opened, and a ramp lowered onto the tarmac. The containers were unloaded and hitched up to trucks, which filed out of the airport gates. High-value electronics were constantly being flown into the UK as consumer crazes came and went. One day it would be phones, the next game consoles, then flat-screen TVs. Whatever the next big thing was, it would be flown in from the Far East as quickly as possible. By weight, the newest fad gadgets were worth almost the same as a precious metal, but unlike gold or silver, they went off like strawberries and were soon valueless. The containers were heading for an anonymous warehouse in Dagenham. It was run by Koreans who minded their own business and never paid late or broke any rules. It wasn't a busy warehouse. It shipped 3 or 4 consignments a year. Just another mean, grubby building in a zone of such. Yet the business of the warehouse was remarkable. The consignments it marshaled were of people, plucked off the streets almost at random. These unlucky souls would be added to the ranks of the missing and were sent to spend the rest of their short lives teaching English in North Korea. This time they were taking delivery of a dozen gray plastic containers, each containing a man. "Do you mean to tell me there's not a single television in this mansion?" said Smith to Stafford. "It isn't a mansion," Stafford informed him. "It's a large townhouse." "I stand corrected," said Smith. "Now, about the TV?" "I'm afraid we do not have one." "You must get bored out of your mind," said Smith, disgusted. "Indeed not," said Stafford. "I have my books and my journal to occupy me." "What about Jim?" "He has his internet." "It's unnatural," said Smith, "and very suspect if you ask me." "I think not," said Stafford. Smith sat up and took out his mobile. "An RIB," he said, "coming up the river. Surely they aren't going to try to repeat the attack. That would be crazy." He looked at Stafford. "It might be kicking off again." Stafford picked up the machine pistol from the floor by his chair. "What is the plan?" "As soon as an attack starts, hopefully my lot will be swarming all over this place. We'll have to keep them at bay for a bit. Do you have a panic room?" "Unfortunately not. It is planned." Stafford was considering another attack from the river. "They won't be able to get in from the river this time." "Why are they coming back?" Smith answered his phone and listened to the caller. "Okay," he said. "Good." He looked at Stafford. "False alarm, Bertie," he said, relief in his eyes. "I wish you wouldn't call me Bertie," said Stafford. "I might get used to it again." James Dean Yamamoto was dumbfounded by what he saw on the screen. Jim had willed the chair back with every appearance of contentment. "How can this be real?" Yamamoto asked Akira. "How will I explain it?" "I hope it won't be too inconvenient." Yamamoto logged off, then back on. The balance remained the same. "Evan's-san must be very rich." "I believe so." "That explains everything." Akira raised his eyebrows. "How so?" "Why, Kim has kidnapped his woman." "Kim? Basho Kim?" "Yes, Kim, perhaps. I will know for sure soon." "But Kim is a big man, surely not a criminal." "A big man, yes," said Yamamoto, "but very deep in debt. He owes trillions of yen more than he can repay." He sat down heavily in a chair that was normally on the other side of his desk. He frowned and appeared to fall asleep. His eyes flickered open. "His name may be on much of the Tokyo skyline, but he has run out of the means to maintain his repayments." He laughed in a single burst of a low-toned syllable. "It is a trap in which many of us are caught, and one he has worked very hard to become ensnared by." He exhaled in a growl. "He is the lowest of the low. If I would kill anyone, it would be him." "Kim-san, a kidnapper?" "And worse." Yamamoto stared up at the ceiling. "So much worse. I suppose I must tell you a story." He let out a long snort. "When I was still young, I used to enjoy chasing the ladies. Life was good. I had money." He smiled a little. "The world was so fresh, and finally it was being good to me. Life can be so good. I had a sweetheart who lived in the Ginza, and I was very much in love." He paused to recall. "To a rough guy like me, she was a princess, a sweet little bird who sang for me. She lived in this tiny apartment, and I made sure she was all right and could pay her rent. Ginza is such an expensive district, as you know. She always made me laugh. I still smile at the thought of her." He fell into a reverie. Akira watched him, remembering. "Then one day she vanished, gone like a picked flower." His face was twisted in anger. "I traced her family, what there was of it, but no one had any word of her. She had not given up her lease. She did not use her bank account. There were fresh groceries in the kitchen the day she went away. Ah, Akira, I was heartbroken. I'd not realized how deeply I loved her. She was my happiness." Yamamoto glanced at Jim, who was listening in the way people do when they cannot understand what is being said. He turned back to Akira. "I became crazy. I hunted high and low. I hired detectives, 2 or 3 at a time. I fired them and hired more. I spent all the money I could to try and find her. Then one day the answer came. She had most likely been kidnapped and taken to North Korea. I was horrified and filled with uncontrollable rage. How could this happen?" Jim had given up trying to understand and had returned to the trading screen. Gold looked about to take a dive. He wanted to jump on it. It was a screaming short. A few clicks and he could be on for the ride. He sat back and shook his head. He was like an alcoholic who had fallen off the wagon and bought a nice big bottle of whiskey. "Then I went looking," growled Yamamoto. "I wanted to find out how people could be kidnapped like that. Korean visitors could not just show up to pick people off like plums from a tree. It took organization, money, skill. I would use my contacts and track these people down. Then I would make my play." He grunted in disgust. "While I was doing this, devoting my time to the search, I was making money like never before or since. My property portfolio was growing, and its value was shooting up. This was the beginning of the bubble years. It was a deep irony to me." He frowned as if a great sadness had filled him. "So then one day the secret opened itself to me. A friend of a friend who stole the tax on ships came to me and asked a favor. I told him my puzzle and promised to solve his problems if he solved my riddle. He went pale. I saw this, and he knew I saw it, and he told me, 'Basho Kim-san.'" "What did you do?" asked Akira. "I reverted to the old way." He looked pleased with himself. "I sent him a letter with her name on it, and the letter was charred. Then I burnt down one of his buildings. I repeated this action every moon, and sure enough, after a few months, my sweetheart was returned." "Was she all right?" "No, she was a broken woman." Yamamoto rose. "I still look after her." He looked across the city. "She's down there somewhere. She has a husband and children. It's a happy ending." He turned to Akira. "That is my story, one of many in my strange life." He pushed back his tidy gray hair. It made to puff up in a ghost of a quiff. "And now the story continues." "When do you think you will know for sure?" asked Akira. "I know for sure. It is a matter of where, not who. I guess it will become a matter of how to get her back." Jim's mobile was buzzing in his pocket. "Yes," he said. "Jim Evans?" "Yes." "Your lady is very sick. We need the objects in 24 hours or we cannot be sure she will survive. Prove to me she's alive." "Of course." "Who are you?" said Jane, her voice echoing in a hard space. "Are you talking to me?" "We will organize an exchange." The phone went dead. Jim looked at Akira and Yamamoto. "We're running out of time." Chapter 54. His room in the Grand Hyatt was lovely, and the bed was perfectly comfortable, but he was finding it very hard to sleep. It was daytime in London, and his body knew it. He lay awake, his mind racing. He had called Stafford 3 times, and all was quiet on the home front. It wasn't like him not to be able to sleep. Then at 5 a.m., the inevitable happened. He passed out. The phone at his bedside woke him. It was 7 a.m. Akira was on the other end. "Evans-san, Yamamoto-san has news. When will you be ready?" "Give me a few minutes. I'll come straight down." He jumped out of bed and ran into the shower. The water shocked him with a cold blast. "Shit," he muttered, adjusting the temperature. He was out again in 2 minutes, drying himself. Akira met him in the lobby. He looked rough, as if, like Jim, he hadn't had much sleep or time to shave. "Yamamoto's car is waiting." They walked swiftly outside to a black Toyota Crown. It was an old car, but it shone like new. They got into the back. Yamamoto was in the front passenger seat. "I think I have found her. Let's go." The chauffeur set off. Jim noticed he was a very old man who drove as carefully as if the car was stuffed with nitroglycerin. The roads were busy, but the traffic flowed. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Where are we going?" repeated Akira in Japanese. "You'll see," said Yamamoto. Jim got out of the Crown and looked at the polished gray granite building. Across the broad entrance it said Yamamoto Towers in English, then probably the same in Japanese characters. Yamamoto was striding towards the entrance, and Jim jogged to catch up. The Japanese businessmen bustled through the revolving doors to where a reception committee stood. Everyone bowed. The welcoming party saw them to the lifts and bowed at them as the doors closed. The lift was saying something to them, and Jim wondered what it was. He hadn't been in a talking lift before. They were heading for the roof. When it stopped, Yamamoto strode out and around the roof garden to the far side. Jim gazed at the rocks and gravel, all perfectly placed, and thought how bizarre it was that anyone would want a rockery on the top of an office block. A telescope was set up at the far end with a young guy of about Jim's age beside it. Yamamoto squinted through the eyepiece and smiled at his employee. He said something that sounded to Jim like, "Well done." Then he indicated that Jim should look through the eyepiece. Jim crossed to the telescope and found he was focused on another giant tower. The floor in the center had some kind of garden in it, with what looked like an aviary. If you're going to build a rock garden on top of a building, he thought, why not a greenhouse? Yamamoto was talking to Akira. So, said Akira. Evan-san, your lady is being kept in the zoo you can see before you. He stood up. That's a zoo? Whose zoo? Kimcorp Zoo. Jim was scanning the floor for a glimpse of Jane, but all he could see was vegetation and birds. Are you sure? Yes. What the hell is Kimcorp? Huge property company, said Akira. One of the top 5. Can't we just get the police to bust in? I'm afraid Kim would be the first to know. By the time a raid happened, your lady would be gone. Jim took a deep breath and blew it out, frustrated. He looked back through the telescope. Can we see the other side of the building? Akira asked Yamamoto. Yes, said Yamamoto. We should have helicopter photographs very soon. The animals went silent, and moments later the lift door opened. She stood up and held the plate by her side. She had sharpened it in the small hours and hoped they might not have noticed. She had tried to be subtle about it, but if they'd been awake... As she could hear only one set of footsteps, she guessed she had got lucky. Kim stood in front of the cage, well back. She watched him closely. Only a small section of the plate's rim was now blade sharp. If she hurled it through the bars at him, she'd pray for a miracle. "Who are you?" said the man. "Who are you?" she replied. He reached into his pocket. "It doesn't matter," he said, pulling out the dart gun. He pointed it at her loosely. "I don't need to know your name." He fired. It took him a moment to register the clank. Jane picked up the dart from the floor. It had discharged most of its load with a blow. She didn't think, she just did. Thinking made the barely possible impossible. She had to be in the moment, in the zone. Accuracy came from the deep subconscious, the brainstem, the hypothalamus. She lanced the dart through the bars at Kim. He flinched as it stuck in his neck. He squeaked in shock and reeled back. He pulled the dart from his flesh, dropping it to the ground. Jane was smiling. A very satisfactory shot. The tranquilizer was in a puddle at her feet, and she guessed the round was spent, but her victory had a kind of small perfection. Kim tottered forwards and staggered, then careered headlong into the bars of the cage. "Thank you, Jesus," she said, and ran to the bars. Clearly the round had had some sting left. She knelt down, grabbed his arm, and pulled it through the cage bars. He didn't have a watch or a band on his wrist. He must have a tag under his skin. She took the plate. She couldn't lift him to the door latch, so she'd have to cut his arm off. In the circumstances, it wasn't such an unpleasant prospect. She pushed up his jacket and shirt sleeves. She went to undo his cufflink. "Bingo!" she muttered. The cufflink was the key. She took it out of his cuff and stood up. Red lights around the room started flashing. "Damn it!" she muttered. She pushed her arms through the bars to the control surface. Nothing happened. She already knew the problem. She went back to Kim and pulled his other arm through. It was the other cufflink. When they were both in range, the system operated. When they were further apart than the length of his arms, they set off an alarm and ceased to function. She tried the lock again, and the door clicked open. She leapt out. She opened the gorilla's door. "Come with me," she said, but the gorilla just looked at her. She didn't wait. The lift was going down to the floor below. She called it, then looked into the camera. Its little red light was lit. If she could deal with the people in the lift, she could get free. She could go back and use the man as a shield, but she wouldn't be able to carry him with her. No matter. Attack was always the best way. Jim looked at the photos. An indistinct figure sat in a cage. Was it Jane? It was hard to tell. He felt sick and his face bunched up in disgust. "I'm so sorry," said Akira. "This is horrible." "Don't be sorry," he said. "At least if that's her, she's alive." Yamamoto was slumped in a chair, apparently fast asleep. "Pay the ransom," he said. "What did he say?" asked Jim. "Pay Kim," Akira told him. "That's not going to work, is it?" said Jim. "Why?" "For one thing, I owe you an object. And for another, if we give them to him, he can't leave any witnesses behind, can he? Not me, not you, least of all Jane. We can't take the easy way out. Jim sat up a bit. I've got something for you, he said, smiling ironically at Akira. He reached under his shirt and pulled out the Yasakani no Magatama. He lifted it over his head and handed it to Akira. Akira held up his shorthand in shock. Take it, said Jim. Yamamoto had woken up. No, said Akira, not yet. We are not sure if it is Jane-san, nor do I wish it returned until I have secured the sword Kusanagi and Yata no Kagami. Yamamoto was suddenly wide awake. That doesn't make any sense, said Jim. I trust you to continue to bear Yasakani no Magatama with honor. Yamamoto was staring at Jim. Kusanagi, Yata no Kagami, Yasakani no Magatama. I'm sorry, old friend, said Akira, but I have lured you into a legend. James Dean Yamamoto was sweating profusely again. He watched Jim put on the green glowing necklace and cover it with his shirt. Then he began to laugh uproariously. Sweat and tears were trickling down his face, and he clasped his legs. What's so funny? Asked Jim. Akira shrugged. This will surely kill us all, wheezed Yamamoto. Akira translated. Chapter 55. The lift door opened to reveal 4 men with stun guns. They'd have to be dweebs not to get the better of her. There was no time to let them surround her. They were fanning out. The guy to the left jabbed at her, and she kicked him in the chest. He fell. She grabbed the guy to the right as he lunged, but the charge from the guard in front shot through her. She flipped backwards, then cried out as another shot pulsed through her. When she woke up, she hurt like hell. They'd done a good job of tenderizing her. The gorilla was looking through the bars. She lay there for a few moments, then hoisted herself up. At least they hadn't stripped her. You should have come and given me a hand, she said, sitting down by the beast. It put a hand on her head and stroked her hair. Jane was wondering whether she was going to get another chance. She looked around the cage. The plate was gone. She checked her pocket. Not surprisingly, the cufflinks were gone too. The necklace felt hot around Jim's neck, the ends of the jade teeth pressing into his flesh like fingers. He adjusted it. Then he jumped to his feet. Shit, he said. Kimcorp, is that like a listed company? Akira looked up from the photos. Yes, Evan-san, on the TSE main market. Main market listed? Yes. Jim sat down again with a bump. Well, 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 he clutched the necklace under his shirt. You know what? I think I might have a bit of an idea brewing. Jane stood in front of the gorilla. She put her right hand on a bar, and the gorilla did the same. She gripped a bar about a foot away with her left hand, and the gorilla copied her. She stood on the 2 middle bars, then pulled with her hands and pushed with her feet, trying to wrench the bars from their moorings. They didn't move, but the gorilla might have the strength to bend them and shatter the welding. The gorilla watched her curiously, seeming amused by her antics. Jane dropped down from her brace position. You don't get it, do you? She said, laughing a little. She scratched the back of her head. The gorilla scratched its head too, then offered a hand to Jane. She took it. Gotta get out of here, she said, before it's too late. She let go of the gorilla and walked into the middle of the cage. She sat down, legs crossed, and put her hands into her lap. She closed her eyes. She was going to clear her mind. Then she was going to send herself out of her body, float around the cage, and imagine it afresh. There was always an answer to any puzzle. It was just a matter of working it out. Once you had the answer, it seemed obvious, but before you had it, it could stare you in the face and you wouldn't see it. Calm was the platform of survival. It didn't matter how desperate you were or how close to death. Calm was a prerequisite for rescue. As she stilled herself, she imagined she was like the gorilla, sentient but not quite smart enough to work out a way to escape. If she could double her IQ, she could waltz out of there, but instead she had to strain for the insight that would set her free. In trying to fly beyond the boundaries of her mind, she hoped to release herself from her preconceptions and assumptions. Her mental bonds trapped her as effectively as the bars. That was why the mad were especially dangerous. Their thoughts were untrammeled. their solutions often unimaginable to the normal mind. Without the limitations of the sane, they could find the doorway to another level. This was the doorway she sought. Do the obvious, she told herself. She stood up and walked to the ledge where the tiger had lain. She had hidden the chopsticks there. She had put them on the other side of the bars where the cage frame met the floor and was shielded by the ledge. She squatted down, pushed her hand along the cold edge of the metal cage, and fished out a chopstick. She smiled. They'd missed it. She climbed onto the ledge and put the chopstick between her teeth. The bars of the cage were about 6 foot above, but the tiled shelf had a ridge to grip about 3 feet above her reach. She scrambled up the wall to it and hoisted herself onto the bars. She balanced, adjusted her grip, then swung from bar to bar. She turned, rotating 90 degrees to hang between the horizontal bars. She had become so strong over the years that the stress of holding her own weight by her hands was of no account. Finally, all those years of swinging on frames were actually proving useful. Jane swung her legs up between the bars and wrapped them around one so that her weight was braced by her feet. She slid along it until she was comfortably below the CCTV camera. She took the chopstick out of her mouth and stretched out to the CCTV with a point. The extra 6 inches of wood gave her the necessary reach to stab it. The camera wasn't designed to take abuse, and after a couple of minutes, the plastic eyeball fell out of its housing and hung on its wires. Jane put the chopstick back between her teeth, reached up as far as she could, and took the camera in her fingers. She tore it out and dropped it onto the floor. That's better, she thought. A little privacy. She unlocked her legs and hung from the bar 6 feet off the ground. She looked out of the window into the blue sky of the Tokyo afternoon. Hanging felt good. It was like stretching. About half a mile away, a chopper was hovering parallel to the window. She focused on it. It was at the same level as her window and in line with it. She dropped to the floor, ran to the window, and waved frantically. The aircraft's nose dropped, and it headed away. Had it come for her? Was it her people, the DIA? Was it just another pervy moment from the creeps holding her in a cage? Was a tourist having a look at the zoo on the 67th floor? She sat down and went back to clearing her mind. "Evan-san," called Akira. "We have confirmation. Please come and see." Jim walked to Yamamoto's desk and looked over Akira's shoulder. There was a picture of Jane hanging behind the bars of a cage. "Oh, bloody hell," moaned Jim. Akira flicked on to the next image. Jane was on the ground, waving at them. "Thank goodness for that," sighed Jim. "I thought she was strung up." "No, Evan-san," said Akira. "She looks to be all right." He flicked through the images uploaded from the chopper. "I hope they haven't spotted the helicopter," said Jim. Akira didn't reply directly. "There's no building that overlooks this side of Kim's head office. It was the only way to be sure." Jim nodded. "I know," he said. "Now we've got to get in there and bust her out." He picked up his satellite phone. "Here goes. If this doesn't work, I'm just going to go in there on my own." "I will be with you," said Akira, clenching the fist on his short arm. For the DIA man, it was 2 a.m., but when his phone rang, he answered. "Hi," he said, his voice gravelly and slow. "Will, it's Jim." Will sat up in bed. "What's up?" "I've found Jane." "Go ahead." "I need your help to get her to safety." "Where is she?" "Tokyo." "Leave it to us." "No," said Jim. "She'll be dead as soon as you make a call to the authorities." "What's going on?" "North Koreans connected at the highest level in Japan. I can rescue her if you'll help me, but it has to be fast, and it has to be now." "I'm listening." "Okay, this is what I need." Chapter 56. Kim was sneering at the doctor. "I'm afraid, Kim-san, that your heart is weak. You need more rest before you can resume work." He didn't reply, just held the oxygen mask to his face. The tranquilizer had laid him so low that he had nearly died. He knew he was unfit, and he had not made his health a priority, but he had been shocked to discover just how weak he had become. Now he lay disconsolate in his bed, confused, his whole body aching to sleep again. He hated the doctor for the news, and despised the nurses who tended him. He was nauseated by the thought that they should see him in such a pathetic and vulnerable state. When he regained his strength, he would go up to the zoo and shoot the woman. She was a demonic banshee and had to be liquidated at all costs. He didn't have the strength to imagine what else he would do with her, but it would come to him. Then he would know he was strong enough to get up. Jim was downloading his trading software onto James Dean Yamamoto's computer. He was praying it would work. Software was almost guaranteed not to work the first time. Whatever could go wrong would go wrong. The installation ended with a prompt for his login and password. "Ah," he said, mildly surprised that it was working. He typed in his ID and his password. Jelly deal. He offered a prayer to the gods of binary. "Yes," he exclaimed as the desktop booted up. There was an hour and 20 minutes before the close of trading in Tokyo. He pulled up Kim Corp's stock chart. It looked okay, but he smiled when it dawned on him that the chart looked as if it was going to crash. "You betcha it is, and I'm going to crash it." He called his friend at the bank, Sebastian Fuchs-Smith. "Jim," came the startled reply at the other end, "you've caught me heading to work." "You want to make some money?" "Me, mate," said Sebastian, every syllable honed at Eton. "I'm never unhappy to make a little extra cash, old chap." "Kim Corp on the Tokyo Exchange. It's about to go down like a duchess." "When?" "Any time now. Count to 100 if you like. Tell the floor." Jim hung up. Akira pulled up a chair next to him. "May I watch?" he said. "Sure," said Jim, as he laid out the chart of the stock in the right-hand corner of the screen. He placed the order window, the interface where he entered buy and sell instructions to pick up or let go of shares he was trading, to the left. He had all kinds of orders he could place, and robots to slice and dice them before they were sent to the market. For Jim, it was like a textual version of a computer game, where armies were massed and sent against the troops of other players. In this game, there were only buy and sell orders, and whether, when you called a move in the market, you were right or wrong. Traders would stare at charts, hoping to guess the next few seconds and thereby glean an advantage over the other players. But with hundreds, sometimes thousands of people buying and selling, the outcome of every following moment was strictly random, or so it seemed, and so they said. Yet for Jim, what happened next was obvious. He was supremely rich because he could see what would happen while others had simply no idea. "What are you going to do?" asked Akira. Jim grinned. "I'm going to crash the Kim Corp stock price." "I know, Evan-san, but how?" "Do you buy shares, Akira?" "Not really." "Is that no or yes?" "Occasionally." "Okay." Jim was watching pressure increase as Fuchs-Smith and the London bank started to sell. "When a stock is falling, do you want to buy?" "No." "When a share is rising, do you want to buy?" "Most likely." "So you have some shares and the share price suddenly starts falling heavily. What do you want to do?" "I want to cry," Akira said, as if he had actually experienced such a moment. "Well, apart from that, do you feel more like selling?" "Yes." "Well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make people want to sell. First, though, I'm going to own the market." "Own the market?" "I'm going to buy from all the sellers, and I'm going to sell to all the buyers. And when they're all satisfied and gone, I'm going to fill up all the places for buyers and sellers with my orders, and I'm going to control the price. Then I'm going to walk the price down." "Walk the price down?" "I'm going to sell when the buying is weak and make the price fall even further. Then I'll let it settle, maybe buy some back. Then I'm going to do it again and sell it down. The price will fall, and at some point, panic selling will set in. Then when the market collapses and pukes, I'll buy back again, and I might even make a profit. I'm going to do it again and again and again. By the time I've finished, Kim Corp's share price will be a smoking crater." "Is that legal?" Jim smiled at him. "You are the one with the carte blanche, so you tell me." "Yes," agreed Akira. "You are correct, and I think this is a good use of our permission to do what is required to be done." Kim Corp's share price was already falling gently. "Right," said Jim. "Let's get going." He filled the input screen with a series of orders. Bombs away. In the hour and a quarter to close, Kim Corp dropped 32%. The news wires buzzed with speculation. Had Kim-san died? Was Kim Corp mired in scandal? Was Kim Corp in breach of its banking covenants and therefore on the brink of bankruptcy? James Dean Yamamoto walked behind Jim and bent down to the screen. He exclaimed in Japanese. Jim grinned up at him. Akira said, "Yamamoto-san says you are a very frightening person." "I wish my Nan was alive to hear you say that," he said. "She might have been impressed." Jane smashed the camera casing on the floor. It cracked open like a walnut. She examined the pieces. There was a lens, a circuit board, and a small aluminum frame bent for the assembly to nestle in. She broke out the components and spread them in front of her. She picked up the metal housing and bent out one side. It would make a blade of sorts. Blades were good. It might be what she was searching for. Much later, Jane looked out into the night. A set of lights far in the distance hovered in the sky. She waved. "She's seen us," said Jim. Akira translated. "Ooh," said Yamamoto. "Time to leave then. If she has seen us, others might." He piloted the helicopter away. "Whoever you are," thought Jane, "I hope you're friendly. And if you are, get on over here fast." Kim lay in bed, dozing, the morning light illuminating the room with a bluish tint. His apartment took up the floor below the zoo. It was modern and minimal. The whole floor was more of a facility than a home. He didn't like decoration unless it was a priceless antique. Then it was just another asset, and like all his assets, hawked to the banks. Sometimes, like now, lethargy overcame him, and he would lie there for 2 or 3 days exhausted. Great pleasure was usually succeeded by something like despair. After victory came disappointment. This time the exhaustion was unbounded. Although he was physically recovered, the malaise had overtaken him. The tranquilizer had triggered it. His assistant came into his room. "The finance director must see you now. He assures you it is of vital importance." Kim sat up. Toyota entered respectfully and bowed. "Our share price has collapsed." He opened a folder and handed Kim a sheet of paper with Kim Corp's stock chart on it. "What has caused this?" "I do not know. This morning our share price is falling again. The banks are bound to start calling soon. Soon we will be in breach of our debt conditions." Kim's stasis was replaced by anger and fear. "When?" "In theory, we are in breach if the market falls another 25%. "I will be in my office in 20 minutes. Leave me." Jim was hammering Kim Corp. He owned the market in the stock. Kim Corp and other stocks traded via a system called an order book. It collected all buying and selling into one place, and via the comings and goings of buyers and sellers, settled the price. It was like a rolling auction that matched up the people trading the share. Jim had muscled in and overwhelmed the other players. Kim Corp would normally trade $50 million of stock a day and move a percentage point or two. Now Jim had waded in. He had taken control of the price and was driving it down. He was cornering the market. Market corners, as they were called, were as old as markets themselves. Cornering the market in a commodity or stock was an old game, and always ended badly. The market was always right in the end, and you couldn't fix the price of anything for long. At some point, the market would bite back and hurt the manipulator. Whether it was the silver corner, by Bunker Hunt, the Texas billionaire, Enron cornering electricity, or the oil corner of 2008, sooner or later it had imploded and prices went back to normal. Corners were usually about making a price go abnormally high, but in this case, Jim was forcing a price down. He was crashing the stock by bullying the market. And of course, he had an advantage. He could see what was going to happen next, an hour or two at a time, and could accentuate the moves he wanted. By making money from them, he plowed the profit into forcing the price the way he wanted it to go. Fundamentally, Kim Corp was bust, and he could see it in the company's stock chart. He was just accelerating the inescapable gravitation forces of financial reality. With the picture of Jane hanging from the bars beside his keyboard, he was trading Kim Corp into the ground. Chapter 57. Kim looked at the chart of his stock. It was being destroyed. The stock price line tried to rise, but it was as if a hammer was smashing down on it every time it raised its head. There had been a call from a big U.S. investment bank. This must be something to do with them. He looked up the name of the individual attached to the number. It was one of the bank's top board members. Something was going on, something outside his knowledge and skills. Japanese bankers had been easy meat when he had lured them into lending him billions. They would give him all the money he wanted if it was backed by property. When they were in deep, they had no other option but to lend him more. Americans were different. They lent you money, then destroyed you and took what you had created. They were predators like him. Predators needed to concentrate on feeding off the meek rather than turning on each other, he thought. But Americans didn't understand this. He called. Wolfsburg would do Jim any favor he asked. Jim was a phenomenon, the very thing that PhDs and Nobel Prize winners said couldn't exist. He was the guy who conclusively proved the markets weren't random. He was the kind of person you wanted to be indebted to you. The kid had worked for him once. Jim had made his name at his bank, then gone off and done some crazy shit even Wolfsburg couldn't believe. Wolfsburg hoped he could entice Jim to buy the bank one day. Then the sky would surely be the limit for him and the organization. With Jim, the bank really could become the all-powerful global engine that conspiracy theorists thought it was, rather than a crazy gambler, bullying and cheating its way along. With Jim, they really would be able to call the shots. Using his foresight, they could go from doomed to fail to the world's power pivot. "Mr. Kim, I'm so glad you called." "Mr. Wolfsburg, I have read a lot about you," he lied. "I'm flattered. Thanks for calling me back." "What can I do for you?" "Well, we've been watching your recent difficulties, so I thought I'd give you a call and see if we could be of any help." "Thank you, but what do you have in mind?" "Our analysts reckon you could use some debt restructuring and maybe some new equity." "I do not think that is necessary." "You're probably right, but you know how it is. Perhaps you should have a backstop. We don't know what your debt covenants look like, but we're thinking you might be in breach soon enough. You know how that can set off a meltdown, however unfair that might be." "Our covenants are not linked to our stock price." "That's great," said Wolfsburg. "When can you take a meeting with a team of ours? I think we can help you with your stock price." Kim knew they were probably driving his price down to get their claws into him. It was a kind of extortion racket. He understood that well enough. His stock price had just gone vertically down. "You can come tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," said Wolfsburg, hitting return on his keyboard. 10? Jim Skype said, "Show them some love?" It was Wolfsburg. Jim started buying. Kim Corp stock spiked 3%. Kim saw his stock shoot up. He grimaced and gripped the phone. "Very well. We look forward to doing business. Goodbye." Jim sat back smiling. "We're in." Kim stood up from his desk and pulled open the second drawer on the right of his desk. He took out the pistol and headed to the lift. He would kill the woman and go into the cage. He touched the cufflinks on his shirt. Then his bad luck would end. Yamamoto led them to the boardroom and they followed him. "Wow," said Danny on seeing Jim. The four Americans stood up and began shaking hands. "Reese." "Jim." "Brandon." "Jim." "Casey." "Jim." "Major, right?" said Casey. Jim laughed. "For about 3 hours once." Akira looked at Jim strangely. "Army Major?" "It's a long story, Professor," said Jim. "And I'm Danny. This is turning into an epic," said Danny. "Sit down, guys," said Jim. "First off, thanks for coming." Reese smiled up one side of his face. "No problem." They hadn't had a choice. "Nice to be out of the doghouse. What's the plan?" Jim took the blueprint from James Dean Yamamoto and rolled it out on the table. Yamamoto pinned it down with 4 paperweights. "Colonel Jane Brown is held on the 60th floor of Kim Corp Tower." Akira put some photos down the side of the blueprint. "Is that like Major General Brown?" said Danny. "Yes," said Jim. "Wow," said Danny. "Like the Major General Brown? Now Colonel?" "Probably," said Jim. "Danny's her biggest fan," said Brandon, shrugging. "Hell yes," said Danny. He smirked at Jim. "I take it we're busting her out," said Casey. "Hell yes," said Danny again. "Yes," said Jim. "How quiet has this got to be?" said Reese. "Don't let that worry you," said Jim. Chop her onto the roof, in through the windows, suggested Casey. Roofs covered in aerials. There's no good landing spot, said Reese, studying the blueprints. We could rappel down, then off the sides and go in through the windows. She's in a cage, said Jim. We have to be able to get into that. We've got a different plan. We're going in through the front door. We have an appointment with Kim, said Akira. We will take him, then he will release her, and we will leave the way we came. Sounds good, said Reese. What do you need us for? In case it gets nasty, said Jim. I guess you think that's likely, said Reese. Jim nodded. Reese grinned. That's cool. It's been a while since we've had some real action. We've got to get you boys suited up, said Jim. Can't play investment bankers in jeans. Hey, said Danny. Better be loose, said Casey. We're going to be packing a lot of iron. He lifted his holdall onto the table and pulled out a machine pistol. We'll buy you briefcases, said Jim. Big briefcases, said Danny. Giant ones. Yamamoto-san will organize the pickup outside Kimcorp, and we end up back here, said Jim. All the floor plans for the top 5 floors are there. It's either a simple in-and-out performance, or we're going to get completely screwed. Oh, yeah, said Casey, looking up from the plans. That's how it always goes. Kim walked out of the lift, gun in hand. The woman was some kind of witch. As soon as she died, the curse of bad luck would be lifted from him. His heels clicked on the tile flooring. He took the pistol off safety and squeezed the butt. A pistol had only one purpose, killing people. It was good at it. A life was ended with little more than a gesture. A pointing movement, followed by a slight twitch of the index finger, was all it took to destroy someone. A complex, amazing creature could be shattered beyond repair in a fraction of a second on his slight whim, a moment of beautiful poignancy. Without power, someone was worthless, and with power, they were like a god. A pistol made anyone a god, and right now, like a god, he was going to extinguish a life with a clap of thunder. But first he would torture and humiliate. The gorilla looked up at him as he passed. A fine animal, he thought. When he found a bigger, better one, he would kill this one and put the new one in its place. He scanned the tiger cage for the woman. Where was she? He walked quicker to be able to see the entire cage. It was empty. There were wires hanging over the lock mechanism with what looked like a camera attached to them. He swiveled around, holding out the gun, expecting the woman to jump at him. There was nowhere for her to hide. He spun back to the cage. It was still empty. He shrieked in anger. How was it possible? He went to the wires. They were jammed between the door frame and the lock mechanism. How had she opened the lock with that? The cage door was on a spring, so it would have closed once she had escaped. But what contraption had opened it? He wrenched it out and stuffed it into his pocket. She must be hiding on the floor somewhere. There was no way out apart from the lift. Maybe someone had rescued her while he slept. Perhaps one of his men had stolen her for someone else. He paced around the zoo, the animals shrieking. She must be there somewhere. She would not have been able to operate the lift without help. His phone rang. It was his finance director. Tokyo Bank requesting an urgent meeting. When? Now. Tell them no. They are in the lobby waiting to see you, and so are Kyoto Maritime Bank. So, he put the pistol onto safety and shoved it into his pocket. I will see them on the hour. Who had betrayed him and released the woman? It must have been someone very close indeed. He would work out who, and he would cut them to pieces from their toes upwards and from their fingers in. Chapter 58. Apart from the occasional click of the mouse, the room was silent. James Dean Yamamoto had taken the SEALs out to buy investment bank outfits. Getting to a store that fitted outsized Americans needed the sort of local knowledge they didn't have. Yamamoto was in love with the American GIs. It was like reliving a dream from childhood. He was actually living an old Hollywood movie. He was sure this was a moment of fate, the final chapter of his life where destiny would enjoy the joke of a puppet dancing to its own ironic song. He was being honored. He would jump into the abyss with abandon. Got a minute, Professor? Jim was getting up from Yamamoto's desk. Yes, Evan's son, said Akira, looking up from a magazine. Jim lifted the Yasakani no Magatama from under his shirt. It always felt a little colder when he took it off. He handed it to Akira. "Time to get this back where it belongs. We don't want Kim to get his hands on it." Akira took it. "You cannot go without me," he said, his eyes narrowing. "I will take this and be back in 1 hour, but you must promise to not leave without me." "You'll probably just get in the way." "And you?" "Yeah, me too. But I've got more reason than you to get in the line of fire." "How so?" said Akira, slipping the necklace into his pocket. Jim shrugged. "You know, love and all that." "Honor is as powerful as love," said Akira. There was a knock at the door. It opened, and a tall, beautiful girl walked into the room with a plastic tray. "Mashi," she said, bowed, and left. Akira picked up a box. "So," he said, "I have the correct calling card, and therefore I must come," he smiled. "You have not promised me yet." "Okay, I promise not to leave without you. I will be back at 1:30. Akira jumped out of the cab and walked quickly up the pristine alleyway. Freshly watered bowls of flowers hung from braces, and window boxes were filled with multicolored pansies. The alleyway was a tidy confusion of personal things carefully left out. He stepped up to his parents' door and let himself in. "It's me, Akira," he called. "Son," called his father, "I'm here." He was standing up. "I've tried to reach you for days. I was worried." Akira hugged him, something he had not done since he was a small child. "Where is Mother?" "Visiting her sisters." Akira took a step back. "Father, I have a favor to ask and a great burden for you to bear." "What is it?" Akira took the necklace from his pocket. "This is Yasakane no Magatama. It has been lost for several hundred years, but I have recovered it." He passed it to his father. The old man looked down at the necklace, glowing green and gold in his hand. It felt hot in his palm, like a bowl of miso soup. "What must I do?" he said. "You must return it to the emperor, and only to him. If it is known you have it, you will most likely be killed. You must take it immediately." "Son, you bring glory to your family and to your father." Akira bowed. "I must leave immediately, father." His father bowed. As he stood up, he felt as if his bent back had straightened a little. He saw his son clearly. "Goodbye, Akira." Jim was flatlining Kim Corp's stock, holding it in a range limit to the upside. Every time the stock rose and hit a certain price, he sold it on at that price. The share hit this ceiling and fell back. Pretty soon the buyers would give up hope and sell out, and he would buy the shares back on the fall. He could sense traders coming and going, throwing their money at the stock in the hope that it had hit its bottom. He could tell by the size and speed of the orders how much they had to play with, and he could swat them like flies. Kim Corp had been worth $5 billion when his campaign had started, and it was now worth $800 million. For all the bucking of the market, he was only losing $50 million, and hardly short of Kim Corp's stock at all. If he had been playing the game for money, he would have given the stock one last terrifying downdraft and filled his boots with it on the final puke, as major shareholders bailed out in a last panic. Then he would have left the stock alone, and it would have risen again to its correct price, netting him a very fat profit indeed. But this wasn't for money. He would blow all his billions if that would get Jane out. The trading was just a means to an end. "Hey, Major, put this on!" Something clumped onto the desk. It was a pistol holder. Jim looked up to see Danny beside him. "You look good in a $5,000 suit," he said. "No way, man," said Danny. "This is a $500 suit. I just look like $5,000 in it." Jim struggled with the holster, trying to keep his eye on the charts. Danny adjusted it roughly on his shoulder and pulled the strap up to tighten it. "Got to get my trading bots all lined up while we're gone. As soon as I take my boot off this wanker's neck, his stock price is going to pop up." He glanced at the holster under his arm. It looked flash. "Time to go," said Casey, walking in carrying a briefcase. Jim stood. "Let's rock." Danny grinned knowingly at Casey. "Don't forget your attaché case." Jim picked it up. "Don't expect me to use this shit properly," he said. "Just don't bleed on us if we have to carry you out." "It's blue blood, mate," said Jim. "You won't notice it on your jackets." Kim had sat and watched the meeting. He had not been called upon to say anything. His minions had done the talking and the banks the listening. Toyota presented well. He had all the figures to hand and in his head, and when he was questioned, he could slice and dice them all ways, so that however they rebuilt the numbers, they totaled up correctly and agreed. The figures were, however, all lies, accounting fictions like intangibles, amortizations, depreciations, and accruals, making a mockery of the real picture. He was almost out of cash to pay the bills, and they would lend him more cash to pay them the very interest he was about to be unable to afford. They did this on the basis of numbers that had no meaning in the real world and no connection with cash. It would be funny if it were not so vital. If he gave his finance director all of his company's intangible assets, Toyota could no more buy a bowl of rice than a homeless man living in a cardboard box by Tokyo Station. Yet Kim Corp would borrow hundreds of millions against those empty assets. Without the lies of legitimate accountancy, his business would not have been built. But without the lies of illegitimate accountancy, it would not be standing. Toyota was so accomplished, he reflected. Could he be the traitor in his midst? He listened to the accountant bat back the questions from the banks. With Kim gone, Toyota would surely be the boss of Kim Corp. Could Kim operate without him as CFO? He would think carefully about Toyota. Once the situation had stabilized, he would have a better idea of who the traitor was.